Welcome back. Our next session is going to be on Untold Heroism of the Bulge, featuring Dr. John McMannus, a dear friend of the museum and mine, and from the great state of Missouri. He needs no introduction for those of you who are frequent attendees of our conference or past travelers on many of our educational travel programs, but he's going to get a little one anyways. He is the Curator's Distinguished Professor of U.S. Military History at Missouri University of Science and Technology. In addition to coming here for our conferences and going on tours with us, he's active with many media appearances, 2 podcasts that he hosts or co-hosts, 15 books, including the one that will be featured prominently in this discussion, Alamo in the Ardennes. Joining John to his right, my left, is Dr. Michael Bell. Dr. Bell is the Executive Director of the National World War II Museum's Jenny Craig Institute. He is a career armor officer, retired as colonel, and then continued to serve our nation in various capacities, the Pentagon, State Department, and the National Security Council for another 10 to 12 years. So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. John McMannus and Dr. Mike Bell.
Hey, so thanks, Jeremy. We're going to dive into this period, 16 December to, right before Christmas, 1944. And, we've got the amazing John McMannus here with us as we think about this. And, most of us are familiar with the Band of Brothers story, the 101st in Bastogne, 4th Armored Division's breakthrough and link up. I was fortunate 40 years ago to be there with Charlie Boggess to spend 10 days at Bastogne, walk the perimeter, see where the 101st was. But at each point, there's these glimmers about how did this happen? Who else is out there? Who are the other divisions, the other 32 divisions that fight in the Ardennes besides the 101st, or 31 divisions besides the 4th Armored Division? And so you're just going to start out with kind of a softball for John. What inspired you to write this book, Alamo in the Ardennes? Pretty cool book. Here.
I hear it's good.
Yeah. And
in spite of who wrote it.
What's your big idea there? And we're going to explore this in great depth. But how did you get interested in this kind of side story to Bastogne?
Yeah, so I was on the 60th anniversary of the Normandy invasion, and it was like a D-Day to Berchtesgaden tour. I was one of the featured historians working for that 60th anniversary, and we visited Bastogne, and of course I'd been there and known about it and had studied it, and I was there that day with a couple of 101st Airborne veterans, and to their credit, they seemed to want to talk more not about themselves and what they did in Bastogne, but about what the other units east of Bastogne had done before they ever got there. And it's one of those things where, as an historian, I always kind of knew about that fighting east of Bastogne in the first 2, 3, almost 4 days of the Bulge. I knew about it intellectually in the back of my mind, but I really didn't, And so when I had these conversations, something just kind of clicked, and I thought, there is a much bigger story here and much more to Bastogne than what we know, because I think what we tend to focus on is the siege. It's all quite dramatic, of course. We have this undermanned airborne division that's been rushed into the maw here and is underarmed too on some levels as well, and is going to have to deal with this difficult challenge. But really, I would argue, ultimately, the battle is decided in the first couple of 3 days when the Germans are not able to get Bastogne when it would have been valuable to them within the early part of the Battle of the Bulge. And that is a story of the 28th Infantry Division, a unit that just got out of the Hurtgen Forest, and this is their reward. It's just mind-blowing. And of course then, elements of the 10th Armored Division, the 9th Armored Division, so on and so forth. And so when I came home from that tour, I decided this is something I really want to investigate. And the more I looked into it, I thought this is really such a dramatic human story, because that's what always interests me the most is the human dimension of all this that we study. And I got in touch with a guy named Bob Phillips. Now, Bob Phillips had been in the 110th Infantry Regiment, 28th Division, so he had actually been in this battle. And he had really emerged as the leading scholar of that Bastogne corridor battle, as I'll call it. And he wrote a book called To Save Bastogne, based on his many years of research. So he was a participant, and then later he was an historian. He was, I think, an historian for the Air Force as his career. And Bob was so helpful and so welcoming, and I'll never forget it. He is the real pioneer of this entire battle and the foundation of what we know. But once I got involved with him, I thought this really needs to be a book. And so I just sort of tackled it from that point.
So the book, kind of lays out the route to Bastogne that the German, 5th Panzer Army is going to take, through the 28th Division, portions of the 9th Armored, 10th Armored. We usually think of the 106th Division, which is to the north in the Schneefel, north of the 28th Division, brand new division in the line. But the 28th, tell us a little bit about them. What were they just doing? You mentioned they're in the Hurtgen. I think they need about 5,000 replacements after that combat, from a couple weeks of combat. So, as we heard earlier this morning, these divisions are seen to be pretty beleaguered, if you will. So tell us a bit about them and, what they're expecting in the line, and then how they're disposed, if you would.
Yeah, so the 28th Division had a really tough go already in World War II. It starts as a Pennsylvania National Guard unit. Of course, Omar Bradley was the original commander of it and kind of whips it into shape, before being deployed overseas. They see their first combat in the Battle of Normandy. That's in July 1944, and that was a pretty tough go. They have a wonderful moment, which is really, on balance, their best moment of World War II, when they get to parade in Paris. So when you see those pictures of American troops on the Champs-Élysées and whatnot, they're probably from the 28th Division. But the bad news was they were just passing through, and they weren't going to get to stay there, unlike the 4th ID, which got to stay a little bit longer and had a little bit better time. But the 28th ID then moves on to deal with the Siegfried Line. So they're fighting that battle circa September, portions of October 1944, and that is no easy go, let me tell you. So they've been degraded already in terms of their casualties. It started out as, like so many of these National Guard units do, they start out as a kind of state identity or whatever, and then eventually they're like any other unit in the sense of people being fed in as replacements, and they're from all over. So the 28th then, of course, famously is thrown into the Hurtgen Forest in November 1944, and they suffer something on the order of about 6,100 casualties to gain nothing. Think about what that does to a unit. And of course, we know among those casualties, most of them are happening in the rifle companies, in the weapons companies, at the point of the spear, that 5,000 to 7,000 who are doing most of the real fighting for the division. So it had been absolutely decimated. Its command at the junior level really destroyed. It has an interesting division commander whom you all know, I'm sure, Norman Dutch Coda from D-Day fame, who had been the assistant division commander of the 29th Division on D-Day and eventually does well enough to get his own command, and so he's the division commander. So he has been sent to the Ardennes sector east of Bastogne, which is supposed to be quiet. Famous last intentions, right? And so this is, I would argue, a byproduct of the reality we're facing. I think one of the great myths of World War II is that we win because we just have so much more people and stuff, and it was just going to be inevitable in that sense. We were actually running out of combat manpower at this point, and so there's a crisis point, and the 28th is sent in there to a sector that's much too large for it to hold. At Bradley's level, he's had to take what he calls a calculated risk, where he's going to let the terrain do some of the defending for him because he doesn't have enough people, because we've got these other ongoing operations too happening all along the front. So what that means for the 28th as a division is it's covering a sector designed really for 2 divisions instead of 1. And what it means is that in the run-up to the Bulge, we are under strength in our platoons and our rifle companies, probably by a factor of 30 to 40%. And so it's a bit of a race against time to feed new people in there. It's a bad situation.
And I think in making it more challenging for General Coda, he has to keep one of his regiments in reserve, or the Corps. So he's now covering what would have been 2 divisions with 2/3 of a division. you know, and while you're trying to reintegrate folks. And real quick, let's kind of give them a sense of the regimental commanders, because there is another key figure from D-Day that's in a regiment that you wouldn't associate necessarily with the Pennsylvania Guard unit, and then a bit about Colonel Fuller.
Yeah, so the commander of the 109th Infantry Regiment, which is one of the 3 regiments in the division, is none other than James Earl Rudder of Pointe-du-Hoc fame, who had commanded the Rangers to take Pointe-du-Hoc. Obviously, you know, a famous Texan and infantry officer who has led them extremely well. Well, he has ultimately then gotten a promotion, and he is in command of this infantry regiment. This is sort of Hurtgenish and after, and so his unit is on the southern side of the 28th Division sector. If we could go to maybe some of the maps here to check this out.
How's that one?
Yeah, so you see you look at the lower part of the map. The 109th would be on that southern sector there. That's Rudder's regiment. And of course, the interesting thing too, from a veteran standpoint, of course, many of the Rangers who served under him on D-Day and after really felt very strong ties to him for the rest of their lives, but so did many of these 109th guys too, because a good commander is a good commander, and Rudder was a charismatic, excellent commander in the 109th, and the soldiers appreciated that. Just to his north, right in the central part of the 28th Division sector, is the ultimate bad luck bird of this entire story, is the commander of the 110th Infantry Regiment, Hurley Fuller, who was just taken over shortly before this. So he's post-Hurtgen. And I don't know if we can do the laser pointer, but so he's got glasses on. You see the defendant standing there with his, and very properly at sort of parade rest, I guess. The guy who's glowering at him with glasses on, right in the central part, so he's the third from left, is Colonel Hurley Fuller, who's about 50 years old in 1944. He's a Texan who has at one time attended the University of Texas, dropped out to fight in World War I. And he's really interesting in the sense that he's had a progressive military career in the sense that he has gone up in the ranks, but he's not one of these hotshots that we often talk about. We tend to focus on them, So Fuller has been just a guy, and he's just sort of plodded along. There's nothing remarkable about him except that he's really cantankerous, and and I love that picture of him because it's so like him. He's just sort of like scowling, glowering at the guy. I mean, that was very much his personality. He's a no-nonsense kind of dude. He's had a rough time in Normandy. And really, I think there really needs to be some more work done on this beyond what I just gave as background in the book. He was the commander of the 23rd Infantry Regiment of the 2nd ID in Normandy. So they come ashore the day after D-Day, and then they fight in Normandy. And the interesting thing at that point, Fuller was not a big fan of the M1 Garand rifle. And so he was making sure that a lot of his guys were armed with the Springfield, the old 03 Springfield, which gives them less firepower at the point of attack. Fuller did not perform up to expectations in the fight around Hill 192 in Normandy. All that is the prelude to Saint-Lô and whatnot, and he gets relieved of command. But he was fairly tight with Troy Middleton, who's the 8th Corps commander, and so Fuller stays around as this sort of tangential kind of supernumerary colonel doing nothing and whatever. And so when a regiment opens up with the 110th after Hurtgen, he gets that regiment. So he comes to the regiment, and the guys don't know him, and they don't have a particularly positive impression of him. They think of him as this rear echelon guy, and infantry soldiers never really like that, obviously. And so Fuller had not, by the time the Bulge happens, been able to really kind of get to know his people and connect with them the way you might have wanted.
So we'll come back to the map, perhaps.
We hope.
Well, there's this. So if you would, let's talk a little bit about the 28th's initial day, if you will, of combat. And Fuller has a huge task, doesn't really know his troops. They think he's a bit of a cold fish, and he's pretty spread out. And as we've heard earlier, the intel picture is a bit confused, but certainly they know something's afoot. And so how did they respond initially to this?
Yeah, so let's start with the intel picture. And of course, Greg covered that masterfully, earlier this morning, and especially from the bigger picture point of view. But from the point of view of these guys on the ground and what they're seeing and experiencing during the run-up to the German offensive, it's really quite fascinating because there is a sense from the private soldiers on upward that something's cooking. That the Germans have that buildup that Greg had alluded to, the capability, and then the intention seems to be there that there could be some sort of push. Now, I don't know that anybody envisions the kind of massive, counteroffensive that ultimately comes into being, but from their point of view on the ground, outposting on the east side of the Ower River, manning these small towns, these choke point towns in the 28th Division sector east of Bastogne in portions of Luxembourg here. They really do notice the German buildup, and there's some interesting anecdotes. There's a sergeant I think he's the senior sergeant in B Company 110th Infantry in a little town called Marnock, which is about a mile east of Clairvaux, which becomes a key point that the Germans have to take to get onto Bastogne. And this guy, J.J. Kuhn from Wisconsin, had really become convinced that the Germans were up to something. And so he's sending shadow patrols out to figure out what the Germans are up to, because there's more patrols, there's more patrol activity, so on and so forth. And in this particular sector, by the way, photo recon isn't helping us much because this has bad weather, this sector, and I think about half the missions that we had around this time had to abort, and so we don't have a complete picture except these guys on the ground. Kuhn is frustrated because he thinks his battalion command and then his regimental command, Fuller, doesn't really get the situation. And so he's determined that he's going to have them figure this out, and this is kind of disgusting, but it's also, I think, entertaining. He decides he's going to pick up German soldier droppings from the patrol routes they'd gone in, put them in a manila envelope, and send them to Fuller as a way to say, hey, Colonel Fuller, this is the reality what's going on.
And it's super fresh. It's super fresh, too.
It's super fresh intel. But all due respect to NCOs, this is an NCO who thinks he knows everything, so that means he's an NCO, right? I mean, that's just the way a lot of these guys are, and he knows a lot. But so for some reason, he thinks that's going to wake up Fuller, so he sends it to Regimental HQ. A staff officer accepts this little gift, and the last thing Kuhn hears before he's ushered out of headquarters is Fuller discovering what he has just gotten and saying, "Who the hell sent this to me?" And Fuller being Fuller. So what he doesn't know, and what I think is so interesting, is Fuller's just as worried, and so he's agitating to Coda. Coda's agitating to Middleton. Middleton's agitating to Hodges and then to Bradley. So like all up the line, everybody has this sense of foreboding from Kuhn on up. So in that sense, the fact that the Germans are going to attack is not really a surprise. It's maybe the size of it and the fury and the intentions behind it. So what this means for us by December 16th is that the 28th Division is nowhere near prepared for this. Fuller has done the best he can to get these guys ready and to bring in replacements and all that. We've been doing that all along. But remember, too, the survivors of Hurtgen Forest need R&R. And so that's why a lot of them are in Clairvaux. That's where regimental headquarters was for the 110th. And, it's also a resort town. It's a beautiful, charming little town between two major ridge lines, this little custard bowl of a town. So a lot of guys are back there on R&R, and so they're not ready when the Germans come in full force, because the better part of 5th Panzer Army is supposed to come through this sector.
Yeah, so if you would, talk about kind of the initial, kind of what they do initially. There's a sense like with the 106 they're rapidly surrounded by these Volksgrenadier divisions, and then after a couple of days they'll surrender. And I think you see a different story as you come south to the 28th. And then maybe add, how are they helped by Corps with engineers, which are super famous in the Bulge. But maybe a little bit about what combat's like for these folks on the first day and a half, and how we can sense that.
Yeah, so the general pattern is that the rifle companies are parceled out on the main towns, the choke point towns that you see there. And so what we've got defensive positions outside of the town on any approach, and of course we've got roadblocks too, and you're talking about very constricted roads. And once they go into the town, that really does tend to choke point it. So you'd have like the company HQ in the town, and then you'd have fallback building positions where a lot of these guys would be sleeping at night while maybe 20% of our manpower is out there on outpost or something like that. So this has been the pattern. We've had patrols out too, including patrols the night of December 15th that are picking up the German presence, but don't know really what to make of it. And of course, it's really roundabout right before dawn that the fury and violence of the offensive happens. So,
and if I could jump in too, if we had already, John described it, they're over this extended front, and so you don't have the ability to have a continuous defense. And so the decision realistically is made, we're going to defend these key intersections with strong points, and then we just could patrol in between, or and so certainly the German Volksgrenadiers are able to come through these, the gaps between these company strong points in this piece. But you can kind of see, on one level you kind of go, why did they just defend like that? Well, it's a pretty logical piece as how they set that up.
Yeah, and of course also what's defending the gaps too is our artillery. That the artillery can kind of make up that gap somewhat if you don't have the infantry manpower to cover, which we clearly don't. That the artillery can perhaps restrict German movement or whatever, and certainly they're going to leave a bite on those Volksgrenadier units that are filling those gaps. And so the idea is we're going to hold them off if they ever do come that way, whether the artillery filling the gaps and screen patrols, but also these towns are tough nuts to crack. At the choke point there, because of the prepared positions, because of the buildings, because of the road net tending to narrow and constrict in there, which makes it difficult for enemy vehicles and even troops to move through. So the idea is you're gonna buy time. And so this is precisely what the 28th Division does, especially the 110th, which is really in the vortex of this whole thing. The 110th is one regiment. I don't want to give incorrect numbers, but I'm talking about, anywhere from 5 to 8 to 1 on the other side at this point, because you're right at the point of advance. If you look at the map there, you've got to get to Clairvaux, and you got to get to Clairvaux to get to Bastogne. What is the purpose and value of Bastogne? It is all those roads that converge on it, which you can use as a pivot point to go north, a resupply point, a communications point, on and on it goes. And the argument I make is Bastogne is extremely valuable to the Germans within the first 48 hours. And Manteuffel, the 5th Panzer Army commander, understands this. But the longer time goes on, the less value it has, because speed is everything for the Germans. So if you can cost them time, you can cost them success. And so the 110th especially, the 28th Division writ large, is going to cost them time through these little fights that happen in and around the various towns. One example I'd give is at a place called, we call it Weiler. On site, they often call it Weiler. This is where I Company 110th Infantry is, and it's the pattern I described, but you have one squad out there on outpost under a 19-year-old sergeant named Bill Meller. They don't know what is happening. They just know they have to dig in and fight the best they possibly can. And Meller is losing people one by one, but he's running this squad-level fight. And it may not seem like much, but he and his guys hold out really for the entirety, almost, of December 16th. That's a very big deal, because it's a position the Germans should have had within an hour or so. And those hours matter greatly. So Meller and his survivors ultimately get captured. But you can imagine just what a traumatic fight that was for him and his people. And that's a microcosm.
So, and then there's a combat command, armor combat command that's committed as well in this initial piece. Typically forgotten, and maybe you can talk about why we just don't know their story at all.
Yeah, so we know the larger pattern in the Battle of the Bulge from Eisenhower on down, of course, is to react to this to get the reinforcements there, and obviously that takes some time. So we're seeing that in the 28th Division sector. We're trying to cost them time. All these various rifle companies are doing precisely that. In the meantime, Middleton, running at corps level, is having to grab anything he can get to go in there and help the 28th. And Coda's screaming for reinforcements, as you might imagine. His headquarters is at Wiltz, which is about 10 miles behind the major front lines there. And Middleton ultimately is going to be in in or near Bastogne and whatnot. But so he's laying hands on any kind of mobile formation we can get to affect the situation here. And the first major armor, now you've got the 707th Tank Battalion that's in play for the 28th Division. Fuller's going to use them in an initial counterattack on December 17th, and you can imagine what that's going to be because you're running up against a lot of the 2nd Panzer Division, and so you're just throwing these guys to the wolves. But Combat Command R, or Reserve of the 9th Armored Division, is the closest in the neighborhood, and so they are going to be sent in to defend a absolutely vital crossroads at a place called Antoniushav. And what it struck me in studying that fight was just how similar that dusty, little forlorn, almost nothing crossroads, how similar it was to Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville was just a nothing place with an inn, but it becomes this sort of pivot point for the armies in 1863 fighting this major battle there. Well, this isn't quite as protracted a battle, but Antoniushav is an absolute vital crossroads the Germans must have to get to Bastogne. If they don't have it, it's going to cost them more time. CCR is sent in there, I'm not, without being too dramatic, they're sent in there to fight to extinction, to buy maybe 12 hours for other units to get to the Bastogne area, most famously the 101st, but also other armor from Combat Command B, 10th Armored, who were a little bit luckier than CCR. CCR is absolutely decimated. They lose most of their tanks. They lose many of their people. Some of the survivors gravitate westward and hook up with those other units. Interesting personal element of this. The commander of the 9th Armored Division was a guy named Jack Leonard, and his son was the same name. And of course, the general had died by the time I researched his book, but not his son. And so I got to know his son really very well, and his son, he and his father had a lot of conversations about this. And the son, John Leonard, knew so many of the veterans, and so he really had a personal link to this entire battle. It really kind of opened my mind to the whole thing, and he would refer to his father as the old man. The old man did this, the old man did that, and it was just so interesting. And then he'd talk about various veterans, and he'd say, old man so and so, or old man this, or whatever. And really the personal dimension of this whole thing came to life because honestly, it's hard to really study the CCR fight because most of those guys were gone at the time, killed or captured and never heard from again. MIA or whatever.
So then when they write the green books, the Army's official history, there's not much in that story about these units because there's no one for the historian to actually interview. And so, the folks like Team Harper, which are completely destroyed, don't have a place in the story because of that phenomenon. I think it's kind of staggering when you think about
horrifying.
How those are just subsumed by the 5th Panzer Army, literally destroying these folks as they attack across.
And when the unit is destroyed, its records are gone, and like you said, there's no one to talk to. The famous combat interviews that are done in relation to Bastogne are generally done by SLA Marshals people with 101st Airborne guys who did survive the battle. Really, from their standpoint, the deadlier part of the fighting in the Bulge was after the siege when they're having to go forward and attack, like, the famous fighting around Foy and all that. So, history follows wherever the sources are, and that's really one of the sobering things about this, which was why it was really so revealing to know General Leonard's son, because it was a kind of entry point for me to get to know a lot of these people, admittedly secondhand. But that was all that was left in many cases. It was really hard to find CCR 9th Armored Division veterans who fought in that particular battle at the crossroads. And the sobering reality was because so many of them did not survive.
Yeah, so let's shift a bit into 10th Armored Division, CCB, Combat Command B. And, so Team Harper is some of the ones associated with CCR. You have these names like Team Cherry, DeSaubry. Where do they come from? Because they're not part of the 8th Corps when the battle starts.
Yep.
I mean, it's another one where it's like, how did they get there? But how do you see their contribution and their actual part of this fight?
Absolutely vital, because you talk about timing, they get there at the exact right time. So CCB of the 10th Armored obviously is not an 8th Corps asset. It comes from elsewhere. We're talking at the theater level. Again, just laying hands on whatever you got to get it where you need to go. Generally coming from the south. And of course, 10th Armored is involved in other fights in the Bulge that have nothing really to do with this. So confusingly, like when you're researching the records, and you're looking at a subunit like an armored infantry battalion or whatever, you really had to figure out were they part of CCB or not. Because if they're not, they have nothing to do with this fight. That's how confused and broken up this is. So they are rushed, and I do mean it, they are rushed along that road net up to set up around Bastogne. If we could go forward and take a look at this. Now you see you can see where the teams are listed. So these are basically task forces. These are combined armor and infantry and engineer task forces that have vehicles, half-tracks and some level of tanks and some tank destroyers that are attached too, especially up there around where Team Decibri is fighting. So they're going to be parceled out along those key entry points of the Battle of Bastogne. You probably know.
So let me just, for orientation, you can see Bastogne there in the middle. At the top is Team Decibri with Noville, and then Team Cherry to the east, and then Team O'Hara down toward the south, where you see number 3. And those are the three teams that they've broken this brigade-sized combat command into, and then on the fly, organized them into task forces. So
Absolutely.
Just wanted to make sure everybody's like, what's he talking about? Yeah.
They always say that,
Yeah,
when I'm
okay.
talking, but, and I don't blame them. But so they're parceled out into what are the key parts of the road net, crossroads that are leading to Bastogne. The Battle of Bastogne doesn't really happen in Bastogne in that sense. It's kind of like Gettysburg in that respect. The key terrain is outside of town. In this case, it's along those eastern approaches during this phase of the battle, and we're talking here by the 19th. Now, of course, by that time, we've had a lot happen with the 28th Division that's just been broken apart and has bought time for this to happen. One thing I want to mention before I get a little deeper into this is what happens to Fuller, just in terms of closing the loop.
Yeah.
His command post is in Clairvaux, and of course, as the fighting grows more violent, by the end of the second day and into the third, now you've got German tanks knocking right on the door and blasting shells right into your hotel. It's the Hotel Clairvaux, which is where the regimental command post is located. And so Fuller's actually on the phone with division headquarters when that happens, trying to make them see the true picture as he sees it. And he said he felt like Colonel Travis at the Alamo. That clicks in my mind, Alamo in the Ardennes. And here's a Texan saying that. He must know, right? So he has to escape with the survivors of his HQ. They escape across this fire escape, like a ladder fire escape about 3 stories up, because the Clairvaux was built right next to this cliffside ridgeline. And so you could move over the ladder to get there, and they do that. You can imagine how perilous that is. And they go on this odyssey, wandering away from the Germans, trying to collect people together and have resistance. So, all of that has happened by the time we're even talking about 10th Armored and then 101st Airborne coming here. And and then some of the 28th Division guys who've been luckier have gravitated west, and they're going to be added to the mix here if they're willing to fight. And a surprising number of them still are. So
let me jump in too.
Amazing.
So one regiment will go north to St. Vith, which it had been the
the
reserve.
112th.
Some of them will gravitate to Bastogne. Others will kind of go south and west. But so Colonel Fuller is going to be captured. The German will hit him over the head. And tell us about his story and then the confusion about who the real regimental commander is.
Oh yeah. So this is the other thing, and it's a byproduct of Hurricane Forest. So. The previous commander had been a guy named Strickler, who was very, very highly thought of and was a very, very courageous infantry officer. He'd been badly wounded in the Hurricane Forest, so Hurley Fuller had taken over for him, but he figured, I've done nothing wrong. I had to come back and take over my regiment. So technically, he's the XO, but Fuller has this kind of shadow commander in a way. They're kind of frenemies in a way. They get along okay, but there's never really deep bond of trust there. And so Strickler is kind of doing his thing too, because he's been ejected from the headquarters and all this, and he's with his own group wandering around and getting under tension. And Fuller has his own group as well, and Fuller's not as lucky. He ends up getting captured, clocked by the Germans and all this, and so he's a POW the rest of the war. And ultimately, I think, is liberated by the Soviets on some level. He never liked the Soviets the rest of his life. Fuller Fuller did survive to write about his experiences, and I think pretty well, fortunately. And it's really an insight into the trauma he faced. I think for all of his warts, he did the very best he could in a really bad situation. And the tragedy of the 110th is they never got the recognition they deserve from the Army because of the lack of understanding at the historian level, SLA Marshall and then above, about what had really happened. They had a sense it was like the 106 Division, where these guys just surrendered and that was it, and bummer, you're there and whatever. No, what had actually happened is the 110th fought basically to extinction to buy time for all this. So we don't have a siege of Bastogne, we don't have those legendary events without them doing their thing. We just don't.
Yeah, you have some on the, and if you think of the regiment has about 3,200 soldiers in the battle, they're going to lose nearly 2,800 of those.
Yeah.
They killed, wounded, missing. I mean,
Yep.
And so there is nobody. There's no regimental headquarters. Of course, even the Germans are confused. Who's the real regimental commander?
Definitely. Yep.
It really, but it's an interesting aside for historians where what is else going on that you don't have records for? What is it that we've missed because of this, phenomenon on the battlefield in this case?
Yeah. Happened a lot.
So it's a pretty incredible one. Do you want to, shall we launch into de Sobry or Cherry?
Yeah, let's talk about that. So that you can see they are, parceled out there east of Bastogne to hold up what is, by and large, the 2nd Panzer Division coming their way, and Volksgrenadiers too, and whatever. But I really think that the key point of it all is up there at Noville. Now, that's about a mile north of Bastogne. And the reason that's the key point, only in my opinion, is because the remaining value of Bastogne by the time we're into December 9th here is in some sort of quick pivot point to move north, to reinforce 6th Panzer Army, SS Panzer, whatever we'll call them, Sepp Dietrich and all his guys, and Piper and all them to the north, to give them some help and to get onto the Meuse River and then really make something out of this thing. Noville offers the best hope to do that. So Team de Sobry is elements of the CCB 10th Armored Division. Now that's not just armor, that's not just tanks, that's armored infantry too, from the 20th Armored Infantry Battalion. That's an attached tank destroyer battalion too. There's a lieutenant in there, his has a funny name, Tommy Toms. But his grandson, David Toms, became a very famous PGA golfer, and so that was kind of interesting to me to learn about that, because I'd always known David Toms, and here was his grandfather who's part of this. So they are fighting alongside what becomes is elements, I think it's the 1st Battalion 506 Parachute Infantry that then combine with them. So they're in this really difficult fight, mainly just outside of the town, same pattern here, and it's such a bone in the throat of the Germans, because 2nd Panzer gets involved in this fight that just bogs them down far too long that they can't afford. And certainly you see that with teams Cherry and O'Hara. But teams Cherry and O'Hara is more about Bastogne at that point, which is losing value with every minute that passes. Team de Sobry is that northern shoulder or whatever that could perhaps provide you an entryway north. And that battle goes the worst of all the three for them.
Well, and literally while they're fighting, you've got the 506 and the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiments literally marching up and kind of, in some cases confusedly, joining the fight or becoming part of the battlefield. But you can see the timing of this literally by hours, hours of difference really would have changed the course of this battle.
Absolutely. Hours are so vital here. And so by the time this has happened, by the time we're at the end of the day on December 19th and getting into the 20th, in that sense, the Germans have already lost in terms of Bastogne is anything valuable to them, I would argue. Now, it doesn't mean there isn't still very heavy fighting and that we don't respect the siege and the courage of all those who are penned now into Bastogne, but it's a different kind of fight. If we're looking at the bigger picture, Bastogne just isn't going to be as valuable for them at this stage, and the fact that they don't have it certainly is going to be a restrictive element into what they can do in relation to the larger offensive.
Well, and if you think about the timeline they were under, it was supposed to be 3 days with an extra day to cross the river. We were already at day 4.
Yeah.
You launched the attack with 3 days of fuel and 3 days of ammunition. Okay, so now you already have an overextended German logistics system, trying to make up for this, and then the other side though is these are essentially battalion-sized units defending against a division attack.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Which, to your point about, 8-1 or whatever against you, it's a pretty sporty battlefield for these folks. And
It is.
so that sometimes we just think, you see the German newsreels where the German troopers are kind of going by this American equipment that's burning. What equipment are we talking about? Well, some of this, and it, you get an impression that either they didn't fight, courageously or hold on, and in many cases, even the Germans believe this is an American counterattack, or they see it as a much larger force than it actually is.
Yeah, I mean, they're surprised at the level of resistance and violence they get from what they thought were just scratch forces, and they kind of are. But yeah, I mean, you're exactly right, Mike. I mean, battalion-level forces fighting, division size, or at least regimental size, or battalion plus size formations, wherever we happen to be talking about here. This is a really difficult battle, and I think nowhere more than Noville, which you end up with this 2-day fight, and the Americans ultimately lose the town. But by the time they do, the Germans have been so badly damaged that it's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory for them. And eventually, of course, the Americans are going to come back later during the Battle of the Bulge. There's I think a really interesting element of the whole Noville fight is one of the guys I interviewed was a guy named Jack Pryor, and he was the surgeon in the 20th Armored Infantry Battalion. And I think it really got a window into the reality of the fighting there from his point of view. He's collecting wounded in this tiny little bar area, and then they have a headquarters in a schoolhouse where some of the wounded are going, and he's really worried because he's got too many wounded people near the window that leads into this bar, and he's worried about the glass shattering and getting on the wounded, and that happens, and it's just one crisis point after another of wounded men piling up, and ultimately he's got to figure out how am I going to evacuate them. So you kind of see the fight evolve. Initially trying to pick out where you're going to deal with wounded, and it's all very normal and clean, and then just this absolute mess that you've got probably 4 or 5 times as many people in there as you should. And the sanitary conditions and how Pryor himself is going to get out of there is a window into how this fight develops over the course of about 24 plus hours. He and some of the others do get out, but not everybody did.
Well, and then as you cover in your book, a number of the folks who do get out are evacuated into Bastogne, and they're now in the little field hospital there. What happens to the field hospital that was the 101st Field Hospital?
Yeah, so this is the northern part. It's just one of those things that happens in war. They end up, the better part of all the medical assets, the field hospital, the airborne medical company, and the 101st Airborne, runs into a German column and is captured for the most part. So I think that adds to the medical dimension of Bastogne to make it much more difficult. And this affects Desabry too. This young commander, he's 26 years old. Imagine yourself. He's an alumnus of Georgetown, and he's gotten badly wounded during this fight. He's had half his face torn away. He's in wounds elsewhere, and he is part of this whole medical mix. And he hears the German voices and all that. I mean, fortunately, he does survive the war, and he becomes a general ultimately. But it's really just an absolutely chaotic situation. So by the time we have the siege, the 101st Airborne Division, the remnants of CCB 10th Armored, and all the others who are in there don't have anywhere near enough medical supplies and support. Ammo's a big enough problem. Socks are a problem, of course, other kinds of winter gear. But I would argue the medical side is as acute as anything for a few days.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting dimension because you usually don't think of that. And suddenly, whether it's the breakthrough or the relief by airdrop or gliders suddenly become crucial when you realize that, that there is no evacuation. There is no, there's no divisional capability left, because you think, well, they're going to treat them at their level, and that's gone. They've been captured. Yep. Desabry wakes up and thinks he's in the 101st, little hospital, and instead he's a POW.
Yeah.
And a lot of life-changing moments in those couple days of combat. But
yeah, absolute life-changing, incredibly traumatic. And the weather hasn't even gotten all that bad yet. I mean, that's the other part of this too. I mean, the weather's about to get much worse, much colder. During that initial 4 days in this part of the Ardennes, it really wasn't that terrible. It's not good, but almost anybody who fought there was deeply affected by it. And this was a book that Certainly it was a deep dive into the records and all that and on-site research and all that, but especially the veterans themselves were a big part of the identity of this book. And there was nobody who I could tell wasn't really affected quite profoundly by being involved in this on some level. It was really very, very moving.
So a little bit, the 101st will get a unit citation for Bastogne. Why do you, maybe comment a little bit, why do we only think of the 101st as opposed to some of the others? Because even General McAuliffe is going to say, give credit to these other units, but that kind of then seems like a footnote that trails off. What's your sense of that?
Yeah, and I think it's so unfortunate. And, and to the credit of the 101st veterans, they're the ones who woke me up to this, so they were beating this drum, not trying to take all the credit for themselves. I mean, that's what they were like, they wanted to give credit to the other units. They saw these guys. They saw the guys from the 28th Division who were retreating and had come into their lines and had really been through hell, and I think that made an impression on them too. I think it's maybe just an easier and tidier story, and it's kind of a dramatic story of an airborne division besieged, and of course, the 101st Airborne is the 101st Airborne anyway. It's just plain fascinating, isn't it? Here we are at the seat of the Band of Brothers, right? But and of course, for the upcoming Army-Navy game, predictably, the Army's going to wear uniforms of tribute to the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. I think that's all great, but I wish that we'd have this sort of two elements of the same story, like two chapters of the same fascinating book, because I think the 28th Division, the CCR 9th Armored, CCB 10th Armored is all part of the same thing. They're partners of these guys, and I think it's almost as if we're starting at the end of the book rather than the beginning in a sense, and so I wish that maybe we'd revise that. Now the reason it goes in terms of the citation is, of course, Marshall and his historians did these remarkable interviews with the 101st Airborne survivors, the combat interviews, and you could definitely see how well the division had performed. There was no question about that. But as I said, he just did not, he had a bit of a myopia. He didn't know what had happened for the 110th and the 28th Division sector. And you can't know everything. I mean, you're a combat historian trying to document all these small unit actions, and it's overwhelming, So I mean, I guess that's maybe why, hopefully not obnoxiously, I bang this drum all these years later, is I think now as latter year historians, we can maybe have a little bit of the broader picture. And I really do think the 28th Division especially has to be a crucial part of this conversation. If we're just talking the siege, we're really not talking Bastogne on many levels.
So just one segue on that too, because there's 7 engineer battalions thrown into here as well that usually don't have much notice either because they're not part of a division. So they don't have a 101st or even a 28th Division patch. These are Corps and Army level ones, and give us a little sense about what the engineers do as well, because they're certainly heavily involved both here but on the North Shoulder. Any thought about the engineers and what their role is?
Absolutely. So these are generally Corps and Army level assets, but like anything else, the commanders are just throwing them into the maw. So as an engineer, you're now in a situation in a lot of parts of the Bastogne corridor where you are going to have to fight as infantry, as like roadblock infantry. Now, you certainly have some weapons at your disposal that can enhance your mission, obviously mines and the ability to develop and build these roadblocks or fortifications that are very hasty or whatever. But in the end, that's pretty much what you're doing, is fighting as infantry. So units like the 35th Engineer Combat Battalion and many, many others end up as this scratch infantry, again, to buy time. And many of them end up in Bastogne, and also artillery units too, wayward artillery units as well that are going to constrict in Bastogne as well. The engineers are absolutely vital in winning that time. It's especially like at the CODA level. So General CODA is seeing a lot of these engineers come into his area of operations, and so that's when he's using them as kind of like scratch battalions to throw out there because he just doesn't have any more infantry. He's also, of course, famously using bandsmen and anybody else, signal guys. So during this era, this fight, it really doesn't matter what your MOS is. It's a matter of where you are and what the demand is at any point in time. So some of those engineer units either fight to extinction or certainly to tremendous diminution before they, most of them are going to retrograde and retreat back and be preserved. But their role in this whole thing is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, so you have this kind of tableau of these, the 28th, these combat commands, the armored divisions, engineers. You almost have this image that the 5th Panzer Army kind of rolls over the hill and there's Bastogne. But instead you've had this series of really incredible combat before. One, just a thought on it, I'd welcome that. The Volksgrenadier divisions that come up against, 28th Division and others, in many cases are shocked at the size of the American units. They expected much larger units. They didn't expect the Americans to fight as aggressively. And even in some cases, they will start shooting the American prisoners just because of that kind of, immediate combat battlefield angst, and the officers will intervene and do that. But how did the Germans see these units? And then, what was their treatment, by and large, of those that they captured?
By and large, the treatment is reasonable, I would say. It's not pleasant. More on that in a moment. But, in terms of like the Volksgrenadier units and their composition, this is not the cream of the German army. I mean, these are just guys thrown at the problem. Even in the Panzer units, they're not always the best soldiers. So we tend to have this vaunted image of the German army and all that. And, and obviously it's formidable, but it's not quite Superman or something like that. So their fights are very unsophisticated on some level. When they're in these choke point towns, it's very wasteful of especially these Volksgrenadier infantry, just kind of thrown at the problem with some artillery support. They're having trouble moving armor. I mean, one of the things I think Anthony talked about today is the bridging problem for the heavy tanks and all that. I mean, it's so relevant to this too. It's not until, I think, the end of the day on December 16th and into 17th that the Germans can even get armor across the Aure River in the 28th Division sector. And even then, it's choke pointing in these towns. It's snaking into columns, in Clairvaux in particular. There's this hairpin turn, and they really get bogged down there, but in front of a castle where one company and the signals people are holed up and resisting. And so they're kind of surprised by this level of resistance. They had figured maybe the Americans would just simply run. And of course, there's some cases where that happens, but by and large, that is not what takes place. So some of them, yes, are quite angry once they've lost enough people. When the Americans finally do surrender, there's that dynamic to combat, and the Americans have that too, of course. So there are some shootings, but by and large, they're going to capture these guys and they're going to move them east, and they're going to just send them walking. And eventually, if you're fortunate, you get aboard a train, but then again, you may get strafed by your own Air Force. And so anybody who becomes a POW here, that was another thing that was a bit of an eye-opener for me. Not that I didn't know about the POW experience, but as applied to this is what I'm talking about. Let's say you are Bill Meller at Weiler. What's in front of you once you're captured by the evening of December 16th? Months and months of misery and privation. In the immediate sense, days or weeks of walking in the cold across wherever to Germany, to a collection point, and eventually to a POW camp where Germany's not in good shape and they're not feeding you well, sawdust bread, the guilt of all this, the PTSD of all this. You're probably going to lose 20 to 30 to 40 pounds. I mean, this is traumatic for Fuller, too, as a colonel. Imagine the privates. So that was another, honestly, that was another part of this that I thought, wow, that's a whole story too. That could be its own book. And I really had to just kind of shut myself up, which, as you know from listening to me, is generally good advice for me. But it really is. So that I was like, oh, I want to have that in there too. But I just thought, no, that's not relevant. But I knew that was such a huge part of the story. And I think, again, kind of a microcosm for what American POWs were facing at that point.
No, I think you covered that remarkably in the book. Here's this experience, and then, this transition is difficult. The transition from being a fighter into a prisoner, is an incredibly dangerous period. Yep. And even you have where, as they're captured, the Germans would take the Americans' boots. Yep. So, now, okay, yes, you're walking for days. I kind of had the question in mind, what are they wearing on their feet, at this point? In some cases, that their boots have been taken, all their valuables, their watches, a lot of them hit on the head like Fuller is. But, this is a pretty grim reality as opposed to a kind of, smooth transition, if you will.
And a bit out of the blue, too, because as, you heard Greg talking about, and Anthony before him, I mean, you know, we think the war's over in a sense. I mean, no one would expect this could happen. So if you're one of these guys here, you wouldn't think that you're going to be captured by this time next week. And, you know, it's difficult to come to terms with mentally. And so I think there's a tendency on the part of many of them, at least from what I observe, to kind of blame themselves. We did something wrong. This is we surrendered. We didn't do our jobs, sort of thing. And I think that's so unfortunate, because I think they did do their jobs the best you could possibly do. The order they were getting on and on and on and over and over and over again from December 16th onward, hold at all costs. And when you read that, it's easy to breeze over it, but if you actually strip it down and think about what it means, let's examine it. At all costs. So what does that mean? That means you and I are toast. That's the cost. We're going to stay here and we're going to fight it out and die, or we're going to be captured. Either way, it's a really bad outcome. And so these guys have had to be in the middle of that through really no fault of their own. And I really think they did the absolute best they possibly could.
And what you detail is time and again, the commanders will recommend that they withdraw back. I can disengage, I can pull back. If I stay, I'm going to need ammunition, medical support. And so, no, you can't pull back, and no, you don't get medical support, reinforcements, ammunition. You know, so it's even more grim than hold at all costs, because you think, okay, they're going to get the reinforcements. I'm going to get ammunition. And in each case, it's not available.
Not available. We
so
can't get that to you.
Your task is just to fight until you can't resist any further.
And that's what Fuller kind of has to come to terms with by December 17th, by that evening, that this isn't just any normal German attack or something, that this is something much bigger that means, like you said, we're not getting any of the reinforcements to you. And he's convinced the higher-ups don't really know what's going on. They do, they just can't do anything about it. And that's really, I think, somewhat even worse. It's like, we know exactly what's going on, we can't help you, good luck. And when he comes to terms with that, that's why he makes that Colonel Travis comparison, and then he has to live that.
Yeah, what I think is amazing is in this incredibly desperate situation, you find this tenacity and heroism at every turn. You know, that they still fight incredibly hard, even though the possibility of you know, a good outcome is clearly in their minds, not even in the cards. And that it's really a testament to the American fighting man in this case.
Yeah, it really is.
It's amazing.
Big part of what drew me to it. Yeah, we used to hear many years ago that, and I think quite erroneously, whenever the Germans and Americans fought on anything like equal terms, the Germans always won. I'm still searching for where that really was, because you look at this situation, those are not equal terms. The Americans did extremely well, and they cost the Germans in the larger strategic balance of this thing. And so it mattered on that larger level, not just a sort of, gee whiz, these guys are brave. No, it really does have an impact on why the Battle of the Bulge turns out the way it does. Now, granted, it's always a tough go for the Germans to get what they want out of the Battle of the Bulge. It's not a good concept, and they're probably going to lose. But at the same time, it's easy for us to say that here, and it's another thing to live it and to make that happen are two radically different things. These guys are the ones who actually made that happen by, quote, holding at all costs or whatever else.
Thank you, gentlemen. Round of applause for John McMannus and Michael Bell. Please raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you. Gents, we're going to start in the back to your left, please.
Thank you. During the mention of the Siege of Bastogne, I know they make mention in terms of African Americans, the 9th Field Artillery Battalion, but were there any mentions in your research about any black quartermaster companies that played a role in the event as well?
So mainly once you're in Bastogne, quartermasters and artillery primarily. So you're going to see some of these 28th Division refugees who get to Bastogne who are going to combine efforts with them. So it basically is a matter of, are you willing to still fight? And I think that's true for everybody once they're collected there. So this is a diverse fight, not at the very beginning where, 28th Division is pretty much all white, It's at the later stages by Bastogne, where you have African-American units involved there that are having interaction with the 28th Division and with the armored units too, that have collected in the town and are gonna be part of that siege, yeah.
We're going to go towards the front to your right, gentlemen.